Welcome to the last video in the series. It covers the finishing details on the diorama. Let's begin by wandering along the finished diorama. Note the roadside markers, the bushes and long grass, the children near the embankment fence, the gangers on the track side, the trees, and the fence garden. In the 1960s, roadside marker posts were made of timber, painted white with red dots on one side. I made the posts from 4 scale-inch square styrene. To get consistently sized and placed dots on the posts, I mounted a toothpick in my mini drill press. The end of the toothpick had been filed flat and 1 mm diameter. A small amount of vermilion acrylic paint was placed on the toothpick end before lowering it onto a post that was held in a jig. I repeated the process on the reverse side with metallic gray paint. I used woodland scenic's fine-leaf foliage to represent shrubs and small bushes. Pieces were glued into pre-drilled holes. I vacuum drill swarf away before planting the foliage. Multiple pieces close together produce a convincing effect. I lightly sprinkled several colors of fine ground foam over the pieces to enhance the visual effect. Fine yellow foam was added along the path edges to simulate the often dry or dead margin between bare ground and grass. Here I'm sprinkling foam along the footpath between the rail embankment and the mullock heap. The foam is lightly tamped into place to further blur the margins. I made a few trees to go towards the rear of the diorama. The real trees have very pale bark with just a few dark gray patches. They branch from close to the ground and the branches are long and gnarly. I used my usual method of folding and twisting a length of wire into multiple looped strands. However, this time, I made the strands 50% longer than the tree's height so that I could create longer, thicker branches from the folded loops. The loops were cut and opened out to support polyfiber that was stretched out to be very open and bulbous in shape. Various shades of coarse and fine foam were sprinkled onto the polyfiber, just enough to give a foliage-like texture without losing the openness of the thin polyfiber. Finally, I added very fine leaves sifted from commercial leaf scatter, and a dusting of fine yellow foam to add highlights. I needed gangers to replace the sleepers that I'd added to track, so I purchased a set of Andean models figures. I first sprayed them with grey primer. Next I painted on skin color. These guys will be tanned from working the subtropical Queensland sun, so my palette of colors included white, vermilion, yellow ochre and raw umber. I roughly mixed the colors on the palette before working them a little more on each figure. The palette of colors for the clothing and accessories included white, black, Prussian blue, ultramarine, vermilion, raw umber, and yellow ochre. They were finished with a coat of matte clear before receiving a thin wash of dirty water, followed by dry brushed highlights, and another coat of matte clear. In the 1960s, the house at the end of the embankment had colorful flower beds and a neatly trimmed lawn. I constructed a short length of fencing with a flower garden as a nod to that house. I traced the ground profile along the fence line, onto card, upon which I drew the fence plan. I used this as the template for making the fence. The fence posts and rails are scale dimension styrene strip. The chain link mesh is etched brass. The flowering plants are colored foam glued to the ends of homemade static grass tufts. They are glued to a bed of fine real dirt. Weathering powder was worked into the dirt to represent the rich red soil of the area. There wasn't enough room along the front for 2 fence panels, so I fabricated a metal gate from 20-thou wire and added chain link mesh to the lower section. The gate turns on the long spindle set in the ground. To vary the ground texture, coarse ground foam was sprinkled into low piles in places where rough greenery occurred on the prototype. The first pass consisted of light green and burnt grass foam. It was sprayed with isopropanol before soaking with scenic cement. This tends to flatten the foam and make it look too closed. So while this was still wet, a second pass of coarse and fine foams was sprinkled on and sprayed with isopropanol to wick glue up from beneath. The result is that the foam looks more like rough grass and weeds. I assembled and painted the Queensland scale model's whistle board and curve post, before fixing them in position. They are great little additions. Next, I scraped and scored some timber sleepers to make them look old. I then glued them to the embankment side to represent discarded sleepers. A little fine foam was sprinkled around them to hide gaps between them and the bank. New sleepers were stained with shoe polish and isopropanol. The marker posts and yard fence were brushed with a 9:1 mix of water and grey-brown acrylic paint to dull down the stark white of the styrene. The loco and car were each lightly weathered with powders, just enough to take away the brand new look. The stark black of the bitumen road was muted with washes of light grey-brown acrylic and dustings of weathering powder. I dug 4 holes through the road surface to the underlying plaster to represent potholes. 2 were colored with brown washes and powders. The other 2 were filled with fresh cinders fixed with scenic cement. Fresh tar spread by traffic was depicted with dark gray powder drawn away from the patches. I repainted some cast figures of children. Fortunately, only their backs are visible as the castings have poorly defined features. I modified a couple to make use of their unnatural poses. For example, the boy standing on the fence originally was riding a scooter. Plant roots and crushed leaves were added under the trees and bushes to represent fallen branches and leaf litter. Stands of long grass were depicted by poking small wads of 7 mm and 12 mm static grass into patches of Mod Podge. Excess grass was vacuumed off when the glue had dried. I rely on the less is more principle when modeling scenes. There is a risk of overloading scenes with too much material that actually doesn't add to the scene, resulting in it being unconvincing. So, I called it quits at this point, other than a light dusting of weathering powders here and there. Natural light, backed by a real scene, greatly enhances a diorama, so let's conclude by taking the diorama outside and transporting ourselves back to southeast Queensland around 1970. Queensland Railway's Loco 1761 is running light over the 1-mile bridge towards Gympie Station. The gangers have moved to the track side while the engine passes. The children thrill at the sight and sound of 1761 as it heads into the 5-chain curve and begins the ever-increasing climb towards the station. Then, all is quiet again except for the sound of the gangers digging out and replacing spent sleepers and the excited chatter of the children as they argue about the relative merits of steam and diesel power. I hope you have found the series interesting and perhaps useful. Happy modeling!